My sew-alongs are always start to finish, but today we're going a little further back to the full process of planning and prepping the fabric pieces. We're going to be printing the pattern, planning the fabric, and cutting our pieces together before we get started sewing. I have chosen this lovely Racerback tank by Tiana's Closet, a free download available on her website. Once downloaded, I'm ready to print, and this is the special part. I'm using my new thermal printer from Munbyn. No ink, no wires, and Bluetooth ready. A perfect tool for printing patterns in my sewing space. The printer is smartphone and PC compatible. I'm using my iPad here. I opened the pattern file in the printer's app SharpFox, which is very user-friendly. The printer comes with a card reader, power cord, and optional adapter, and the printer is pre-loaded with a roll of paper. You can also load the printer with letter-sized folding paper. The printer can print different size paper, but for my purposes today, I only need the letter-sized option. Now that I've chosen my paper size, I select the fold paper option in the app, and I load the paper in the back of the printer. Then I print this 9-page PDF. The image is clear and bold, and the document prints quickly. It's amazing not to use any ink, and the paper is both BPA and BPS free. From here, I can separate each sheet along the perforations and tile them as usual. I'm using a marker from my Munbyn dual-tip pen set to trace my size before cutting, so I don't accidentally cut along any wrong lines. This marker set comes with 60 colors, each with a fine tip and a brush tip, and everything is organized within this dedicated carrying case. Now I cut my pieces in my size, one front bodice and one back bodice, and it's time to plan the fabric. I'm going to be using this red and blue striped jersey from Nature's Fabrics. To get a clear view on the final outcome, I'll print a croquis PDF. This is a croquis I downloaded from an old Berta style course. I'll use the roll of paper that came pre-installed in the printer this time, and open the file in the SharpFox app, choose the roll paper option and print, easy as can be. Using my markers once again, I'll select matching colors to the stripes and create a quick illustration. I'm thinking to do the arm and neck bindings in blue and pair the top with sleek black bottoms. These markers are bright and smooth, and the brush tip really does feel like you're using a paintbrush. My favorite part about these markers and the paper is that the ink does not bleed through. Now that I have my mock-up and I'm confident in the fabric choice, let's cut the pieces. I cut the front bodice and the back bodice. It turns out the printer makes a great pattern weight too. And I'll cut my binding strips from the blue stripes. I'm going to be linking the printer, the paper, and the markers below if you'd like to grab these tools for your sewing room as well. Now, let's sew. Place your front and back pieces right sides together. Match your shoulders and pin. Also pin the side seams. Sew each side seam and the shoulder seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. For the armholes, I've cut binding to measure 1 3/4 inches by 24 inches. I'll fold the binding in half right sides together, aligning the short edges, and we'll sew the short edges together with the 1/4 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Doing this for both bindings. Then I'll place my binding right sides together with the armhole, aligning the seam of the binding with the underarm seam. I'm just going to align one single layer of the binding and the raw edges and pin in place. Sew the bindings around each armhole with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Press your bindings out and over their seam allowances, also pressing those seam allowances toward the binding. Then we're going to fold the binding over those raw edges, encasing the seam allowance. I'm not going to be tucking in the raw edge of the binding because the material I'm using does not fray. Once I have that seam allowance encased within the binding, pin in place from the outside. As you pin, you should be catching the raw edge of the binding as you go. And wrap that binding around the seam allowance on both sides. Once you have the binding secured around the armholes, there are a few ways you can choose to sew it in place. You can use a cover stitch machine, a twin needle, or a stretch stitch to stitch on the binding side close to the seam line. I'm going to be using a zigzag stitch. Now that we've finished those armhole edges, you can trim off any excess binding extending beyond your stitches. I'm going to be using my Duckbill scissors to protect the fabric underneath as I trim so that I don't accidentally cut through the front of the garment. We're going to bind the neckline in the exact same way. I've cut a piece of binding to measure the distance around the neckline plus seam allowance. And I'll place the binding right sides together once again to sew the short edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then we can pin the binding in place right sides together and raw edges even around the neckline. Then we can sew the binding in place with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and your preferred stretch stitch. Now that the binding is attached, we'll press it away from the garment, once again also pressing the seam allowance toward the binding so that we can flip the binding over to conceal the seam allowance and pin on the outside. Top stitch along the binding close to the seam line just as we did for the armhole bindings, with the same stretch stitch method that you chose for the armholes. Then you can trim the excess binding on the inside. Here is the bottom of the garment, and I've pressed the raw edge to the wrong side by 1 inch. Use a stretch stitch to stitch close to the raw edge all the way around. And now the top is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Subscribe to the channel for more full-length sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.